Welcome, everyone. It's a great pleasure to see all of you and to host our speaker, Jessie Summers. My name's Sarah Stroud. I have the honor of directing the Parr Center for Ethics at UNC. And we are, as this occasion demonstrates, going strong with our dynamic, star-studded speaker series, even during the pandemic. Alas, without the lunches and dinners that we would normally add into the itineraries, but we're very grateful to have Jessie here to speak and discuss with us. I should mention that we do have one more talk scheduled this semester, which will also be online. This is going to be on April 26th, also at 5 p.m. Mary's College in California will be speaking to us about vain people and how they couldn't care less. So it's going to be about vanity as a vice, something that no doubt, along with anxious morality, we can all use a little reminder of. For tonight, I'm really delighted to host my friend Jessie Summers from Duke University. Yes, I can pronounce the words. Jessie is an academic dean at Duke, an adjunct assistant professor of philosophy, and he's also a fellow at the Kenan Institute for Ethics at Duke, our counterpart, if you will, down the road. He is a trained philosopher, so he is in effect moonlighting as his other profession beyond his dean duties with us tonight. He is the author, recently the co-author with his colleague Walter Sinnott-Armstrong, who I see is here tonight. Hi, Walter, of Clean Hands, Philosophical Lessons from Scrupulosity. So on a similar theme, Jessie's going to talk to us tonight about anxious morality. I'll hand it right off to Jessie, and when Jessie's talk is over, we'll all applaud using our reaction button applause, and then go right to Q&A and discussion with Jessie. Jessie, welcome, and thank you so much. Take it away.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Jordan, for helping to arrange all of this. Good. Let me make sure this is actually working. There we go. Oops. Oh, no, you've got a preview.
Jordan,
there we go.
You can fix? Or
I'm good. I'm set.
Or Jessie, you got it. All right.
I got it. Thank you. The writer Larissa McFarquhar tells the story of Aaron Pitkin, a pseudonym, who decided that he wanted to devote his life to doing the most good possible. Aaron was a utilitarian who wanted to minimize suffering, whether by humans or animals. So he thought what he could do to create the most good in the world would be to work on animal rights. It's an area in which suffering is widespread, and even those who eat meat would be appalled by the conditions in which animals are raised before they're slaughtered. So Aaron believed that with time and attention, he could make real and measurable progress. And he has. Aaron worked tirelessly to promote animal rights, especially for chickens, and he's gotten legislation passed and changes implemented to the amount of suffering that raising and killing animals creates. Aaron did this by optimizing everything in his life: how much he slept, how much time and money he spent on everything that wasn't directed to the cause of animal rights. His life was focused entirely on the greater good. Aaron was also married, but that project didn't go as well. Any time he spent with his wife, Jen, was time that he wasn't working on his projects to make the world a better place. Aaron didn't want to help pay her credit card debt that she had from before their marriage because he thought there were morally better uses for his money. He didn't want to spend time doing the dishes or making food. The reason, again, his time was limited and the moral value of cleaning up the dishes paled in comparison to his moral calling. It's no surprise then to find out that Aaron's marriage didn't survive. Now, when I asked my intro ethics students to read about this case, which I do almost every semester, almost no one is sympathetic to Aaron. It's the rare student who defends Aaron on the grounds that Aaron is showing us what it's like to live a life devoted to morality. McFarquhar herself calls Aaron and the other people she profiles in her book which is on the screen here, a do-gooder, someone who goes far beyond ordinary moral expectations in his life. In Aaron's case, he wants to maximize the role of morality in his life. Now, let's assume with my students that there is something off-putting about Aaron. What is it? There are several options, but here are three. One possibility is that Aaron is too calculating about morality. He evaluates every situation to optimize it for moral goodness. And experimental evidence does suggest that we value social partners more when they express what psychologists call deontological judgments. I know deontological judgments is a philosophical term, of course, but what psychologists typically mean by the term is that the judgments are relatively inflexible and rule-based, not based on calculation of the consequences. Except in introductory ethics textbooks, though, both deontologists and consequentialists follow principles and care about consequences. So let's set that aside and consider why constant calculation itself might bother us. It would be annoying to walk with someone who's constantly calculating the shortest path, cutting each corner and shaving fractions of seconds in each decision along the way. I say that having had a friend who was like that. And it would be annoying to make any plans with someone who is constantly calculating the right thing to do. How could you ever count on them? Imagine a friend who accepts a dinner invitation by saying, I'll be there, assuming, of course, nothing better comes up in the meantime. I had a friend who was like that too. And now imagine that that's their position on everything in life. Another thing that might bother us about Aaron is that he lacks integrity. What that means here is that while Aaron is entirely committed to morality, he views himself only as a conduit for morality, not as someone with his own values. You can count on him to do what he sees as best, but you can't count on him to base his actions around his own individual personal preferences or stick to his previous decisions just because he's already made them. I suspect this is why consequentialists whose actions are explicitly for the greater good make such good villains. People who claim their actions are for the greater good justify their actions in terms of a higher moral principle, but some of us disagree about that higher principle, and some of us just calculate differently and see their commitments as tragically misguided. Finally, maybe Aaron makes us feel bad that we're not more moral. We feel bad for Jen because she wants what morality will not allow. She wants Aaron to think sometimes about her instead of morality. She wants their marriage to enshrine a special relationship that his impartial morality can't allow. So enough about why I might have negative thoughts about Aaron. What would Aaron think of me? So I count myself lucky not to have Aaron around, married to me, since I can easily imagine what it would be like to be constantly reminded of how I'm not optimizing my action for what's morally best. I imagine it's like what it's like living your whole life on Twitter, where anything you do could be criticized, sometimes for good reasons, and sometimes not, for better or for worse, probably both. There's no question that we've developed an online culture of identifying and ostracizing any wrongdoing, however slight. There's a lot to think about in how this culture, how these quick reactions or outrage porn, as Tim Kreider called it, has taken on a life of its own. It's certainly easier to feel outraged, even to enjoy our own feeling of outrage, than it is to engage in more complicated, nuanced interactions and relationships with those with whom we disagree. But whatever the costs and benefits of this easily outraged online environment, and there's a wide range here, from innocent and ignorant comments to violent incitement and aggressive shaming and shunning. And I don't mean to minimize some of it, but the ever-present threat of having one's bad behavior exposed is intended to monitor and control online and even offline behavior. And some behavior should certainly be controlled. But the threat of possibly stepping out of line, even without realizing it, is also what I imagine when I imagine Aaron with me all the time. What I'm doing might be bad, in which case I should be corrected. But it might instead only be less than optimal. I should certainly think about morality when acting, but the little Aaron on my shoulder is not only going to remind me not to punch someone when I'm angry, but will also point out how each of my actions can be improved, everything from donating more to charity all the way down to laughing at a joke. And that finally gets me to my motivating question. If my actions can always be better or do better, then how can I enjoy much of anything? Whom might I be offending or ignoring? Or what better activity could I be doing? Or how is what I'm doing causing problems? Maybe I don't say anything offensive on Twitter and I'm too old to understand TikTok, but everything I do can be evaluated, and also everything I don't do. So the problem is this: being moral requires being aware of what we're doing and what the consequences are. That doesn't mean we should always be calculating, but it does require being constantly alert to the ways that our actions and inactions could be problematic. We need constant vigilance. But here's the problem with constant vigilance. Being vigilant is incompatible with enjoying one's life as one lives it. That is, not at the end looking back over it. What's sometimes called being present. Vigilance requires remaining alert to all the possibilities that you're not seeing, how others might see your actions, and their possible consequences. If being present is required to appreciate life at the time one's living it, and not simply at the end, then remaining constantly vigilant for moral suboptimality or possible wrongdoing will limit how much one can enjoy life. But if one does not remain vigilant, then one risks doing what's wrong. And not simply risks, but sometimes not paying attention to certain moral issues is itself immoral. For example, if I think only of my own health needs and not about others, when I'm considering whether to wear a mask in certain public settings, that indifference to others' health is itself wrong, even if I don't make someone sick, and even if it turns out that this was a situation in which it was okay not to wear a mask. Morality requires that we not be indifferent to our effects on others' health. So here's our dilemma. Worry and don't enjoy life, or don't worry and risk immoral actions. Both options seem pretty bad. We only have one life, so it would be awful not to enjoy it because we're worried about doing the right thing the whole time. On the other hand, what kind of a person do we want to be in this, our one life? The kind of person who's indifferent to morality? The solution, of course, is to worry exactly the right amount. We should pay attention to the moral implications of our actions, enough to be moral, but not enough so that our lives are unpleasant, or alternatively, we should enjoy our lives enough, but not so much that we're immoral. This solution is certainly correct, but it's worthless as worrying about everything we do too much or just the right amount. Is having so little time that we inadvertently offend people left and right the right amount, or too little? So we need to know more. I'll try to make some progress by looking at what worrying too much can look like to establish at least one extreme endpoint, and then try to extrapolate from there. Cases of too much worry show up in anxiety disorders. Cases in which a person worries so much or in such a way that it interferes with their lives. I won't assume that any anxiety disorder is a case of too much worry, but if there is a case of too much worry, it's likely in this category. So anxiety disorders are a good place to start. Now, worry and anxiety aren't perfect synonyms, but they do both get at the idea of constant vigilance. Being worried and anxious both comprise being alert to possible threats or dangers that haven't manifested themselves. If a danger does manifest itself, then you're not anxious or worried, you're scared. You're anxious walking through an area known to have snakes, or I am at least. You're afraid if you see one raise up to strike. What anxiety does for us is focus our attention in a way that gets us ready for a possible danger. For snakes, for less physical dangers like emotional rejections or political situations, at work, say, our attention is focused not on something we're physically looking for, but on something more abstract, a situation or a set of our own thoughts. There's something good for us about this kind of attention. If we never anticipated possible danger, we'd be less prepared when it happened, less able to avoid it, and less ready to respond. So we'd be more likely to be hurt physically or otherwise. So this one aspect of anxiety is valuable. It's good sometimes to focus our attention. Unfortunately, Anxiety isn't just focus and attention. Anxiety is a negative feeling or state that drives that focus and attention. Wandering farther into the snake-filled grass makes the feeling worse, and walking out of the grass makes it better. It's not a feeling we need to have in order to avoid danger. It is effective at grabbing our attention. So anxiety leads us to focus on what will reduce or eliminate the bad feeling of anxiety. That helps us avoid danger if the anxiety is well calibrated to dangerous situations. But anxiety isn't always well calibrated to correspond to possible danger. If you get into bed and then worry that you've left the door unlocked, that might be a reasonable worry or not. But if you've just checked the door and you're still anxious, then your anxiety isn't responding to that possible danger. This can be a disorder. Your anxiety doesn't go away when you lock the door, so you relock the door, or you lock it a certain number of times, or using a certain ritual. These are the things that might make the anxiety go away if it doesn't go away from just locking the door. The rituals don't make the person safer than they were after checking the lock once, but they do reduce the anxiety. Alternatively, and this is the more interesting case, we reinterpret the anxiety. So if it doesn't go away when I lock the door, then maybe it wasn't about the door. So I look for something else that would explain the anxiety. Again, with the goal of trying to get it to go away. Well calibrated or not, then the way that we respond to anxiety is to try to reduce the anxiety. The obvious way that we reduce the anxiety is to reduce the threat that it represents. So locking the door if we're worried about the door or someone coming in from outside. But people and situations are complicated, and reducing a threat is often not the most efficient way of reducing anxiety. So if I'm feeling anxious or worried about an upcoming talk, say, maybe it's a couple of days before giving the talk, it's a new talk and I'm still writing it, to make up an example, just completely out of thin air. I could address that anxiety by writing the talk, but that takes hours and hours. So I could instead address the feeling directly, that is the feeling of anxiety directly. I could watch a show, I could have some wine, I could look at something online that captures my attention by being outrageous or distracting. Those won't reduce my anxiety in the long run, of course, since after my wine and browsing, I still have an unwritten talk and now even less time to finish it. But I could do more browsing and have even more wine and distract myself further from this even greater anxiety, and so on. So once we distinguish the feeling of anxiety from the threat that it represents, we can see how important the step of interpreting our own anxiety is. When we feel anxiety, we try to understand where it's coming from as the first step in addressing it. But feelings can be caused in lots of different ways, some reliable and others not. So, for example, I might be anxious because someone could come in through the unlocked door, or I might be anxious because I drank too much coffee, or because of some other condition, psychological or neurological. If my anxiety is caused by something, coffee or my overactive brain, something other than what would legitimate that anxiety, then reducing that threat won't make the anxiety go away. Checking the door won't make my anxiety go away if I'm not in fact anxious about the door. But the fact that my anxiety won't respond to anything I check will force me to come up with more abstract explanations of my anxiety. It must be caused, I'll then have to assume, by something less obvious or that was not easily addressed. Those with anxiety disorders often understand their ongoing anxiety by worrying about mere possibilities that they might, however indirectly, have brought about some harm. They worry, for example, that their hands might have germs on them and that those germs might get someone else sick, and the person might even die as a result of being sick. Or they worry that their friend might be injured because they might have not prayed correctly for their well-being. That's enough about anxiety for us to re-ask the question of how much worry is too much. The answer then isn't about the amount, but about whether the anxiety is well calibrated to legitimate worry, or whether the worries are instead rationalizations of one's persistent anxiety. Are you worried because you've done wrong, or are you worried and also aware that you could have done wrong? One strong piece of evidence that a worry isn't calibrated to a legitimate source of worry is that one understands their worry as responding to a a mere possibility about one's own, possibly very minimal role in bringing about a possible harm. Such small possibilities are exceptionally hard to rule out, so they make good candidates as rationalized causes, so understanding of one's own anxiety. So to recap how extreme anxiety might work in a moral case, a person feels anxiety, understands it as caused by something that would legitimate that anxiety, which simultaneously makes sense to the person of why they feel the anxiety and reinforces that the supposed cause of the anxiety is worth worrying about. So before I apply this back to the initial question of whether we can enjoy life with these moral obligations all around us, let me anticipate two responses to this picture that I'm suggesting and will continue to develop. First, while anxiety disorders are not well calibrated to the possibility of harm, isn't morality serious enough that extreme concern is always appropriate? So the simplest response is no, some moral harms just aren't that serious and others are very serious. Murder is always worth worrying about, and breaking small promises or telling white lies for small but non-moral gains, saying, I enjoyed your talk, for example, to make the speaker feel better, or good question in response, those might not be worth worrying about. But the more serious response is, of course, morality is going to tell you that morality's concerns are the most important. Claim that most anything can be sacrificed for art's sake, and many professionals take their own professional codes to be more important than any ethical code when those are in apparent conflict. So take an example. Hiro Ono is a sushi chef whose long life has been devoted to making incredible sushi, as recorded in the documentary Hiro Dreams of Sushi. For Hiro, everything is subservient to concerns about sushi. As Roger Ebert said in his review of the documentary, but to what end? The existence of his sons are an indication that he has a wife, although we never see her. He must have a home, although we never visit it. There must be hours when he cannot be at work, but the film indicates no amusements, hobbies, or pastimes. The idea of his courtship of his wife fascinates me. Forgive me, but I imagine that even while making love, he must be fretting about the loss of valuable sushi making time. Now, I'm not disparaging Hiro or anyone else with a life-encompassing passion. I do wonder what Hiro would say of Roger Ebert. This man just watches movies all the time? To what end? But on the contrary, I would challenge anyone to watch Hiro Dreams of Sushi and not feel inspired that perhaps a life dedicated to perfect sushi is a truly good life. My point is only to remind us that if you ask an ethicist what's most important in life, don't be surprised if you get an argument, that's what ethicists have to offer, that ethics is most important. Hiro, on the other hand, might give you a piece of sushi to make his point and reminds you of how you were truly moved by a film. So I'm not disagreeing here with the ethicist, I should say, but I do want to question where the burden of proof here is and what premises are foundational and how we evaluate what makes a good life and an ethical life, and even what ethics consists in. Fortunately for me, those topics are far outside my little presentation here, but I do want to bring them in to muddy the water enough that I don't have to respond directly to the claim that morality is obviously and in every case more important than any non-moral concerns, and is therefore always worth worrying about. All right, second, anxiety disorders, while far from rare, are not the baseline human state either. So why look at anxiety disorders when our concern is normal human ethics? The reason to look at anxiety disorders is because they show in relief what's true of ordinary anxiety. And anxiety is part of our baseline human state. And what they show can provide us with a limit, so to speak, on how much worry is appropriate. First, note how anxious concerns differ from ethical concerns, though one can be anxious about an ethical issue. So here's the difference. Ethical obligations are many and practically compelling. This is true even for someone who thinks there's always a right answer for ethical questions. It's even more true for someone who isn't sure if all ethically difficult situations have unique solutions. But anxiety focuses attention on the issues that one believes to be a threat and therefore that need to be resolved. But the issues that make someone most worried needn't be the most morally important issues. Anxiety distorts their view of what's worth their attention and therefore shapes their idea of what is best to do. And even if they're focused on the most important issue, they're focused in a way that prioritizes eliminating their worry about the issue, eliminating their feeling of anxiety, which may or may not be the ethical response. So to take a non-moral example that I hope is relatable, lots of people are still anxiously cleaning surfaces months and months after it's been clear that COVID is respiratory and not reliably transmitted by surfaces. And therefore, millions of dollars and thousands of hours spent cleaning surfaces could be better spent doing almost anything else to help people. But if cleaning surfaces makes you feel less anxious, then you think about the very slim possibility that someone could get sick from a surface that wasn't decontaminated, and your anxiety is reduced, and you don't think about all the competing considerations that you're ignoring in the process. Now, I'm not making the claim that an anxious person is worrying about something that isn't real or isn't worth worrying about. What I'm claiming instead is that one can worry about a moral issue because of the salience of the moral issue, or because they're worried and need to understand their worry. These might feel the same from the inside, so to speak, but motivation by anxiety has a distorting effect on what one worries about. What they worry about might be important, but that's not why they're worrying about it. If what motivates them to worry about it is that they're anxious and they're trying to reduce their anxiety, they would be right only as a coincidence, just as a bump in the night could turn out to be a burglar. But if you treat every bump in the night as a burglar, then you sacrifice years worth of rest and all the benefits that that will bring in order to avoid a loss from ever happen. None of this tells us when it's okay to enjoy life, though. Is it okay not to optimize? Is it okay to ignore possible moral wrongs, either those that I'm committing or those that I'm omitting to repair? What's the point of this discussion? The point is to suggest that there might be a limit to how much our moral worries should pile up. If we start with the idea that no amount of worry is too much worry about morality, then it's easy to let our sense of what morality requires expand without limit, so that we're always either looking for moral obligations or feeling guilty that we've stopped looking. Any suggestion that we've missed something that's morally important is a failure that we should have avoided. If instead we've established that there is at least one way to be too concerned with morality, then we can look for a point at which our concerns are too great and/or no longer responsive to morality. We've also established that one feature of anxiety is its distorting nature, given that anxiety directs our attention to those features that we think will reduce the anxiety, which needn't be the most morally important features. This also highlights that being concerned with morality is itself something of a balance. Morality requires a lot, and not all of it easily falls into the simple categories of giving to charity and calling people out for using insensitive language online. And that's without even reopening the earlier question of how to balance non-moral concerns against moral ones. So the abstract answer to my opening question of how to balance enjoying life and worrying is to suggest what too much worry looks like and to show that worry correlates with an inflexible focus on certain, often minor moral issues. Saying there is a balance between our worry and enjoying life might not help anyone sleep better at night. Okay to watch a Woody Allen movie without guilt or splurge on a nice meal when that money could always be spent elsewhere. So let me be thankful that I'm almost out of time and end with a very brief sketch of a more practical proposal to answer the question of whether it's morally okay to enjoy something once we've ruled out some of the extreme anxiety I've been discussing. What I'm going to say here aren't the only answers. I think utilitarianism and virtue ethics both have their own answers to the question of whether and how to enjoy life. But here's a very quick overview of the answers that I would give. So the first answer to the question of whether it's okay to enjoy life is no. I mean, that's Aaron's answer, and I think we see why someone might be tempted by this answer. A more moderate position might be, yes, enjoy life, but always feel guilty about what you're doing. I was raised to believe a version of this answer, and I imagine others were too. Of course, always feeling guilty is going to make it hard to enjoy life. So a more general way of putting this option might be, yes, enjoy life if you can. If you can enjoy your life while always feeling guilty or while always being aware of what you should be doing instead, then enjoy. If you can't, then such is your plight in life. So here's the problem with the second view. There are many problems, but here's one problem with the second view. It rewards ignorance. So if you want to enjoy life and the obstacle to enjoying life is feeling guilty or knowing what you should be doing instead, then the key to happiness for you is ignorance. If you don't know what your moral obligations are, then it'll be much easier for you to feel fine about what you're doing. And that leads us to the response to that, leads us to a final proposal, which is the one that I'll endorse very briefly. Is it okay to enjoy life? Yes, but only if you can do so while remaining curious, so that your enjoyment cannot be at the expense of knowledge about your moral obligations. But curious about what? So I think we have an obligation to know ourselves, to understand what moral obligations we have, how we might be wrong about what moral obligations we think we have, and about the obligations we might be missing. So you can't enjoy life by being ignorant. And actively ignoring concerns that others are trying to get you to pay attention to isn't a response either. But curiosity doesn't mean only looking out for new obligations, but it also means asking more about the obligations that you think you have. So return to the examples of the kind of echo chambers and quick reactions that make people feel anxious about moral missteps online. It's good, morally required, I would even argue, though I haven't here, to think about how what you say affects others. But curiosity isn't the same as identifying mere possibilities. It's always possible that what you say could offend someone. And you should be curious about how what you say can affect others. But you can remain curious without maintaining constant vigilance. And you can also be curious about how well calibrated your worries are to your moral obligations, how ethical obligations work together, and what makes for a good life. That curiosity might move you to act. Sometimes it will. But curiosity is not feeling anxious about the mere possibility of doing wrong, which I hope I've suggested could very plausibly come from a source other than genuine moral concern. Thanks.
Thank you, Jesse. Let's have a round of virtual applause for such a stimulating, thought-provoking talk. I'm going to try to tear my attention away from my own worries and anxieties, which I'm busy analyzing, to invite questions. We welcome questions. Please just use the reactions tab to raise your hand, raise your Zoom hand. When I call on you, then you can unmute. Alex Putzer.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Summers, however we address each other here. Really interesting.
Jesse, it's fine.
Jesse, okay. I have one question, and thank you very much for this presentation. It was really good. At the very end, you say you need to stay curious, whilst you need to stay curious to find out if anything you do possibly offends somebody. So I'm thinking, since each person has an individual level of anxiety and curiosity and all of this, what you're describing in a sense is a very individual feeling, but at the same time, a collective one. So I was wondering about this relationship, because I have to find out for myself how to enjoy life, how to stay curious enough. What if my entire surrounding has, in a sense, even if we don't even know what the right morals is, but they have the wrong morals, and we would offend them by acting morally. So we would have to change that to not offend the people around us. I don't know if you understood what I meant.
Let me say a little bit in response, and then you tell me if I understood what you meant. Let me start with where you ended the question. So people around us could be mistaken. and I could be doing the right thing and offending the people around me. So if I'm both thinking about how not to offend people and thinking about what morality requires, then it looks like I'm stuck in a situation like that, because either I offend people or I do what morality requires, and both of those are objectionable. There's something objectionable about both of those. Yeah, that sounds tragic. I mean, I'm not sure that that's I'm not sure if that's going to be a particular problem for the thought that we should be curious about what our obligations are as an antidote to being, or as an alternative to being, say, worried about our obligations. I think what I would want to rule out in that description is a case where we're worried about the mere possibility of offending people. So it's possible for people to be offended in lots of ways. Should we respond to that? Well, I would say not to the possibility, no. I think we should be genuinely curious about what is offensive to people and why, and whether they're tapping into something that we should be sensitive to ourselves. But the mere possibility that we could be offending them, I don't think is something that should motivate us.
Can we move on to Jonathan Kirk?
Thank you for this fascinating talk. One question I have is, do you think it's ever actually possible to reach a morally optimal state? I sort of take the view that it's not, that the Aaron 10 years from now, if he's doing his job well, would be appalled at the Aaron 10 years ago. And then sort of as a practical matter, I guess what I would do with this is to try to carve out a few hours for reflection each week and sort of do a personal moral continuous improvement program. I don't know what you think about that, and then don't worry the rest of the time. Just do the morality that you know. And what do you do in your life about this as a practical matter?
So I think it's a really interesting point to think that we should even wonder about how our own standards will change over time, and so be skeptical of whether what we're convinced of now will convince us later. I think that's an interesting point. I will say I like your suggestion that as a practical matter, finding a way to be curious about ethics and our ethical obligations and so on. I think that's an interesting idea. It's certainly a nice alternative to the idea that you should always be optimizing. It gets a nice suggestion. I don't know what would be a good, this is something that I've been wondering about. I've been thinking a lot about curiosity lately, but I'm not sure as a practical matter what would make for a good suggestion. I like that suggestion, but it's certainly one that I would have to spend a little time with.
Up inadvertently. Jesse, if there's some uncertainty about the queue, I'm going to insert myself into it.
Sure.
So I think you make a great point that the mere possibility of the mere possibility of particularly small moral wrongs, it shouldn't be something that preoccupies us. And I thought it was a really stimulating idea that if it is preoccupying us, something else rather than really being, the cause of our worries. But I mean, one of the things that's scary about potential moral obligations is that they could actually be really large, right? So, if some utilitarians are right, then it may not even be morally permissible for us to be in the jobs that we're in, or to have bought a country house in Vermont, just to take an example at random, right? And so if something is not a mere possibility, but something that has serious arguments behind it, and if true, would be a really major shortfall from what's morally required, it doesn't seem as if we can dismiss anxiety about that in the same way that we can, the kinds of cases that I conceded to you.
Yeah, I think that's right. So one thing that I didn't say, but that you're pointing out is there are really two factors that we're trying to balance when we're deciding how, say, worried you should be about something, what the appropriate level is. One is the magnitude of the badness, and the other one is something like the likelihood that you are going to do anything about it. So your action will actually, will bring it about. So there might be only a very small chance that what I will do in, if I spread some harmful fertilizer on my yard, there might be only a small chance that it will kill someone who walks by my yard. But given the magnitude of its killing someone, that would be enough for me not to use that fertilizer. So you're right. What if successful, I think all I've done is to say what looks, I think at first, like something that can only expand in one direction might actually have some limit. But a perfectly fair response to that is, yeah, but that limit might be so far out that for practical purposes, you can still assume that there is no limit. That's possible for everything that I've said here. I think I will feel like this is a success if I can just say, we've got some idea of what an endpoint might look like, and then we can use that to try to work our way back. Maybe we can't work our way very far back, but at least we've established there is such a thing as too much worry about ethical issues. I think I would be happy if I could end up at that position.
Yeah, thank you. Jack Van Dyke, sorry about the earlier audio problem that interfered, please.
That's okay. I had myself on mute. It's very clear that I'm the oldest of this high group and all that type of thing. And to be very honest, it occurs to me that this causes a lot of anxiety. If I have to keep that anxiety with me, good grief, I'm not that far away at the end of my life. Why would I worry about it? I will leave that up to a guy by the name of Summers. I think he talked to us. Just let him worry about it. I don't want to, and I sincerely have that problem. I don't want to worry about it. I mean, there's an end to everything. Why would I have anxiety? And it is, of course, obviously, as one can hear pretty clearly, the trouble within the expressions all done in English. A very good language to talk about it in the first place. There are better languages to do it in, and I know some. So this is amusing and interesting to hear, but what can I say? The positive thing is that I have all my hair. Not everyone else there has. Talking about anxieties.
You mean the anxiety of having to use shampoo? It sounds terrible. So, so what this reminds me of is the so I'll explain why in a second. When my grandfather was towards the very end of his life, I remember my uncle criticizing him for smoking, and then we had a discussion about why would you quit smoking now? You know, this doesn't seem to be the time to quit smoking. That doesn't mean that it was justified to continue smoking. It was just that it would have been let's say insensitive at the least to try to push for him to quit smoking then. So if your question is, should I feel anxious about my obligations the older I get? I mean, one response is it's understandable if you want to say, let the kids deal with it. It would be understandable. On the other hand, that's not to say that the obligations are any less pressing. And in fact, I think in some ways, probably you have greater obligations as you age to do what you can. You have more knowledge, more power in some places to bring things about. So I suppose if your concern is just I don't want to, well, I mean, I understand that, but that's not going to be much of a justification.
Well, am I in? Okay, you hear me?
We can hear you, but can I move on to
Okay.
the two other hands, and then we'll come back to you if we have time for a follow-up? That's
Sure.
usually how we usually police a bit on the follow-ups to give everyone a chance to ask. So let's go to Michael Vasquez, followed by co-author Walter, and then we'll see if we can come back to your follow-up, Jack. Michael.
Okay, great. Yeah, thanks so much for the talk. There were kind of two ideas that I wanted to, maybe you could just pick one. One is kind of an invitation to say more on the basis of like, I'm a little bit worried about the term curiosity. And then another is just like clarificatory question. When I hear curiosity, I think sort of like, it almost has off-putting connotations of sort of dabbling, like you're dabbling in morality, your moral commitments are tentative and provisional and weak. And of course there's a positive side to that, but I worry there's always like sort of a little bit of like tourism and freely going in and out of whether you want to be moral. And of course, dabbling is good when it comes to hobbies and art, but maybe dabbling is not so good when it comes to morality, which should have sort of a full grip on everybody, ideally. And that part of, like, I guess one way to bring that out is I could see I like the yes, you can enjoy life, but with curiosity, I really like that kind of idea. I do worry it might be abused as a kind of shield, an excuse that people might use to get themselves off the moral hook and explain why, for example, when they're making in the kind of world we live in, I think related to Sarah's question, the moral stakes are always very high, just given what we know and the sort of world we live in. You're making a decision about whether to have a child. If you have the child, there's huge environmental implications we know about. There's implications for children that are alive in need right now. We just know so much that it seems like the stakes are really high. And I worry that curiosity will be, I wonder if you could say more about the ways it could be abused and used as a kind of shield for getting off the hook, morally speaking. And then just the clarification and other about curiosity is, isn't it compatible with someone who would say it's still a kind of strategy for optimizing? The reason you should enjoy life, but with curiosity, is that anxiety is in some sense self-defeating. You'll be a less effective, optimizer or agent if you don't enjoy a little bit. So it sounded almost like it could be a kind of sophisticated consequentialism where you are enjoying life because otherwise you'll be self-defeating in some larger sense in terms of optimize. I was just wondering if you think it's compatible and with that interpretation, which I suspect it shouldn't be, but anyway,
Um, so I'm wondering why you think it shouldn't be. I mean, I think you might be right. Look, so we try to respond to both parts of this. I think you are right to push on what curiosity is actually getting us. I certainly don't say enough here to put any real weight on it. And while it is something that I've been thinking about for a little bit, it's not something that I feel confident enough at this point to try to put something forward. I mean, I'm not sure that I would believe what I said, a week from now anyway. I think your point about using it as a shield is a really interesting one. I think that you're right that curiosity, I certainly don't intend that, obviously, but you're right that there's nothing in the idea of curiosity itself that keeps that requires a person to dig deeply into a subject. So just saying curiosity doesn't get you as far as I would need to go. And certainly if the strategy is to say, don't be worried about, and this is something that I was thinking about quite a bit, don't be worried about the little things, be curious about things, then there's a pretty easy way of interpreting those where you're just saying, where like, look, you don't get to make an argument by just putting a synonym in here. I mean, you've got to articulate a real alternative. And you're right to say, if I can't really give you something more than just a synonym that has maybe some different connotations, then why not just say, well, the problem was, a utilitarian, Aaron's a bad utilitarian. He's really good at accomplishing things that he wants to accomplish, but for how long? Maybe for years, maybe for a decade, but at some point this falls apart and he might have been better off. Maybe, I mean, I don't know, but you could imagine like he might have been better off to wait. Do you want to join me for Q&A, buddy?
No.
Okay. He might have been, better off being less concerned and less optimizing, and that would have been a more optimal solution in the long term. So you're right. So I wish I had more of a response to give you at this point, and I don't. I'm curious what more of a response would be. Maybe as a dabbling sort of thing, and maybe more deeply. I'm not sure yet. Thank you, though.
Walter Sinnott Armstrong.
Hi, Jesse.
Hi, Walter.
I wanted to ask about other people and the role of other people in this dialectic. And there are two sides to that. One is the kind of first personal side. If I'm anxious about whether a certain action that I'm considering is immoral or not, is it legitimate to just go ask other people and talk to them? Would that be helpful to me? And the third, of course, you got to figure out which ones and which ones you trust, but if you pick the right ones, can that be helpful? And the third person side of that is if I have a friend who's suffering these extreme anxieties and not enjoying life, what do you think we ought to do to help them if you want to?
So in the first case, so the third case, the third person case, seems like the alternatives are you address their anxiety or you address the concerns, and I mean the things that they take to be the objects of the anxiety. And I think it's hard in the abstract to know which one of those strategies is better, because it sort of depends on what their concerns are and whether they're actually motivated by their recognition that these are real concerns, or they're being moved by their anxiety. So I mean, I guess what I'm really saying in response is, you know, do you suggest the person needs therapy, or do you suggest the person needs to work through what their real obligations are? And I don't know in the abstract, but I assume that's you know, either of those could be on the table. In the first person case, I guess you have to talk to other people, don't you? Because you would never know, you know, if I'm anxious about something, how am I going to know if it's if it's something worth being worried about or not? You would almost have to get other people to weigh in on it, right? I mean, do you see any way that you could do it first personally without, you know, I mean, you could, you know, talk to people in sort of a more removed way, like reading books or something, but I don't see any way that you get it just from reflection. Do you?
No, I think you've got to turn to other people. And sometimes the anxiety builds and builds and becomes too extreme because you're not listening to them. You think you know the answer, and you don't have sufficient humility to actually learn from your discussions with them.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's a good point. Yeah, this is interesting. This actually, you know, let me make a note to myself. At some point, we should discuss how this idea of curiosity connects with the idea of humility. But we don't have to have that discussion here.
That is a great moment to say that we should officially thank and release our speaker, but I believe he is available to hang around for a few minutes on the call for any follow-ups or questions that we didn't get to. But let's draw the session officially to a close with thanks to Jesse and to all of you for the stimulating discussion. Thanks, Jesse.
Thanks, everyone.